Welcome to our next chapter, Post-Biblical Judaism and the development of the oral law, the passing on of the traditions that were brought from the times of the Tanakh and are now being passed on from generation to generation until our times. In this class, we will learn about the Jewish bookshelf and how it developed, about the Jewish traditions. We will continue into the Second Temple period. We only started it. Although we finished the period of the Tanakh, we are still in the same time period of the Second Temple, and we will define it more accurately. We will talk about the oral traditions, the oral Torah, the oral law, and how, according to Jewish tradition, it comes from Sinai all the way to our times. We will talk about the institutions passing on the tradition, the Sanhedrin, and later on the books that will really complete and pass on the story of the oral law, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. We will talk about challenges on the way, such as the Hanukkah story, and difficulties that Judah had over here with enemies from outside. Also, the destruction of a temple by the Romans and Hadrian will be part of a historical context that will take us through this period where we will start 5th century BCE in this chapter and go forward 1,000 years until the 5th century, until the closure of the Talmud. So let's come back first to the beginning of the Second Temple period, the Persian times, where we left Ezra and Nehemiah. Remember them from last time? Ezra was the one who, according to the tradition, created the Jewish leadership of the Persian period. It is called the Great Assembly, Knesset Hagdolah. And so we hear from the Talmud, Maimonides, the members of Ezra's court are called the men of the Great Assembly. And they were, remember, it's the same prophets we just talked about in the end of the last chapter. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, Nehemiah, Mordechai, Zerubbabel. Many other sages were with them, numbering altogether 120 elders. The last of them was Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the righteous, who was included among the 120 and received the oral law all from them. He was high priest after Ezra. Okay, what did we just read here? We understand that under the Persian Empire, there was an autonomy. Here in Judah, we have coins of Judah. If you take out your 1 shekel coin, that's a coin from the Persian period. The laws that Ezra and Nehemiah made were laws of the land for all of the Jews. You couldn't just go off and work on Shabbat if you wanted to. They would close you down. The law was the laws of autonomy, the laws of the Torah, and the Great Assembly was the leader of this autonomy. This will all change once the empire changes. Of course, it will be a different political structure. But it's important to understand the political structure of the end of biblical times, which will be very different in post-biblical times. Of course, the Persian Empire will come off the stage of history here in Israel at the year 332 BCE. With the campaign of Alexander the Great, here he is with his famous horse Bukphilus. He will conquer a huge empire, the largest empire until Britain. And in this empire, Israel is included. And how do the Jews do with Alexander the Great? Great. The relationship between the Jewish people here in Israel and Alexander and this new empire is a good relationship to begin with. Very good. Many children that will be born will be called Alexander. The Hellenistic influence will be very, very clear in the language, in the institutions, in the culture of the Jewish people here in Judea. The story which is very famous in this context is the story of Shimon the righteous. Remember Shimon HaTzadik, who was high priest, and his meeting with Alexander the Great. It takes place in Antipatris, in Afek, right where the roads 5 and 6 meet. There's that fortress on the left. So that's also a good story if you want to look it up, about the meeting between Alexander the Great and Shimon the righteous. And that also really fits well with what we said earlier. Shimon the righteous is the end of the great assembly of Knesset HaGdolah, and Knesset HaGdolah, that leadership of an autonomy, will be cancelled at this time period. It will not continue under Alexander the Great. So we have kind of a gap. We have a lack of leadership, and we will need to find an alternative. We'll be getting there very soon. First, just to remind us that the empire doesn't continue as one empire. After the death of Alexander the Great, it will be divided. And over here in our area, we are on the border between the Ptolemaic kingdom on the south in Egypt, which will include Israel in the 3rd century BCE, and the Seleucid Empire that is north from us, from Syria on, and you can see in the map, they are the main successors to the empire of Alexander the Great. Under Ptolemy, worth mentioning, the Septuagint, 70 Jewish elders who are invited by the Ptolemaic king to translate the Tanakh, to translate the Bible into Greek. And that will be the foundation of the Greek translation that is with us until this day. That will be the foundation of a Bible of the Greek Orthodox Church. So that is an important event on a Jewish perspective, and not only Jewish, of course, from the 3rd century BCE under Ptolemaic kingdom. And in the meanwhile, of course, the oral tradition needs to continue, and Jewish leadership needs to continue. And let's read from the Mishnah, and we'll explain soon enough what Mishnah is. But we will read now from the Mishnah, from the Tractate of Avot, chapter 1, about the tradition passed on from generation to generation. Moses received the Torah from Sinai. The Mishnah here talks about written Torah and the oral Torah, and transferred it to Joshua. Joshua transmitted it to the elders. The elders are a group of 70 leaders that were appointed by Moses himself. And they passed it on to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to men of the great assembly. We just talked about them. They said 3 things: be measured in judgment, raise many students, and make a protective fence for the Torah. That's interesting. They say about themselves, they start also to create more laws that are not from the Torah in order to have a fence around the laws of the Torah. Shimon the righteous was of the last survivors of the men of the great assembly. He used to say, the world is based upon 3 things: on Torah, on service of God, and on acts of kindness. Antigonus of Socho received from Shimon the righteous. Does something sound a little strange? Antigonus, what kind of name is that? You're right, that's Greek. You all heard of Antigona probably also. And here we are already under Hellenistic influence. And the Great Assembly is already cancelled. And if we continue to read, Yossi, son of Yoezer, and Yossi, son of Yochanan from Jerusalem, received from them. And we'll start now hearing about couples. It's a whole period of couples who receive and pass on the tradition. These couples are leaders of the new institution of leadership. It is called the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin, in which language would that be? Greek again. Sin in Greek means together. For example, if we want to make sure we are finishing on time today, we can synchronize our watches. Syn, together, chronos is time, or the god of time also. So synchronize is time together. And many other synthesis, right? Synthesis, two theses together. And synhedrion in Greek is sitting together. And that name will be adopted to any kind of Jewish court. It can be a small Sanhedrin of 3 judges. It can be medium. And the great Sanhedrin of 71 greatest rabbis of the time will be sitting in Jerusalem. And they will pass the laws that are according to Jewish tradition because they dedicate their lives to learn Jewish tradition. It's important also to mention that unlike the Great Assembly, they do not have all the authority to enforce their laws. There are other political leaderships that can be stronger. Even in the Jewish perspective, not everybody will take the judgment of a Sanhedrin. There's also the high priest in the temple, and the high priest in the temple and the Sanhedrin do not necessarily agree. He is the ritual authority, and they are the rabbinic authority, but they do not always agree and come to the same terms. Also, the political leadership, Hellenistic and later on Roman, will have its say, and if it's a Jewish independence, which it will be, the king will have his say. So there'll be a political governor, Jewish or non-Jewish. There'll be the Sanhedrin. There'll be the high priest. So they do not have the authority and the monopoly over law in Israel. But the Sanhedrin will have the responsibility of passing on the traditions from generation to generation. We will take a little break from the development of the Jewish institutions and law because it was interrupted. It was interrupted by Antiochus. Antiochus Epiphanes, the fourth, will start intervening in Jewish religion, in the Jewish temple, bring a sculpture into the temple, and take over Jewish religion in Jerusalem. And against him there will be a great revolt at the year 167 BCE. And the success of the revolt, after 4 difficult battles, the liberation of Jerusalem at the year 164 BCE will be celebrated until this day at the holiday of Hanukkah. On Hanukkah, we celebrate 2 miracles. One, of course, the victory. Judah the Maccabee won over the Hellenistic Seleucid forces and liberated the temple, rededicated the altar, the worship of a temple, and the worship of the God of Israel in Jerusalem. So that is a huge accomplishment for little Judah to overcome this big empire, which is, by the way, growing weaker and weaker at this point in time. And another miracle that we celebrate on Hanukkah is one little oil jar, which was the only one that remained pure after all the desecration that the Seleucid soldiers did in the temple, and it was used to light the menorah. Only one problem: this little oil jar will only be enough, or is supposed to be enough, for 1 day. And there's no more oil to continue to light the menorah until we can purify the soldiers, everybody after the war, and create new olive oil for the menorah. And the miracle that we hear about from the end of the Second Temple period is that that little jar was enough for 8 days until they brought the new oil. And in memory of that little oil jar that was enough for 8 days and not only for one, we have a lot of customs on Hanukkah until today. And also, of course, the main commandment of the holiday, which is to light the Hanukkah menorah. The Hanukkah candles, the Chanukiah we call it in Hebrew. Of course, it's not a menorah. A menorah has 7 branches. And the Chanukiah, the Chanukah menorah, has 8, plus another candle called Shamash. So it's altogether 9. And the Chanukah candles are there to remind and advertise, publish the miracle of the oil jar, the miracle of the fire that continued against nature. So the commandment is to light 1 candle on the first day, 2nd candle on the 2nd day, 3rd on the 3rd, and so on, until on the 8th day of the holiday we have 8 candles of the Chanukah menorah, and of course 1 more. The reason we have 1 more, the Shamash, is because all the point of the 8 candles is not for home use, is not for better light, not for better heat. It is only for publication of the miracles of the salvation that Israel had. So in order for us not to be using the light for anything else, we add another candle in case we happen to be enjoying the light, so we'll have also a candle that is functional and not only for the publication of a miracle. If you missed the last 30 seconds, never mind. Chanukah menorah has 8 candles, and the regular menorah from the temple that was from Mount Sinai, that one has 7, and that is important information, of course, to remember. Also the customs that we have, like eating latkes or donuts, things with a lot of oil, come to remind us of that miracle of a little oil jar that was enough for 8 days. And we have more customs. Some of them are also Christian influence, like the dreidel, like Chanukah money, which come because Chanukah falls always next to Christmas. It's around December. This coming year, 2019, it's really right in the same week. So when Jewish kids have their Christian neighbors get money, get gifts, so that also encouraged giving Chanukah money to the Jewish children too. But these are also customs. The dreidel is a German toy. It's like dice, but it was converted. And now in the dreidel, all over the world, we have 4 letters. Nun for Nes, miracle. Gimel for Gadol. Hey for Haya. And Shin for Sham. There was a big miracle over there. Over there, they played all around the world and remembered the miracle that was over there, in Jerusalem, in Israel. But in the dreidels that we make here in Israel, we have different letters. Nes Gadol Haya Po, a big miracle was right over here. So those were a few words about Chanukah, and one more little word of advice. It is the most beautiful time to take afternoon tours in Jerusalem. It's around 5 o'clock in December, since it's early sunset, but you can take tours in the old city, also in other traditional neighborhoods all over Israel, and see how candles appear in all the windows. It is a very beautiful sight, a very good time to go in the different alleys of the old city in the Jewish quarter, of Bnei Brak, and many other places in Israel. It's a very popular tour too. So if you have a tour around December and it's a high season, because it's both Hanukkah and Christmas, many people are on vacation, Christmas vacation, so it's a very good idea to take them on such a tour, which we call the Hanukkah tour. The book of Maccabees, to remind you, is also part of the Old Testament for Catholics and Orthodox Christians, so it is also a story that you can connect to the Christian story in many ways. We won't elaborate right now, but just some food for thought. The prayers we have on Hanukkah, Al Hanisim, Ma'oz Tzur, they remind us to be thankful for all the miracles we have from that time until today. Always a good reminder. Coming back to the Sanhedrin and moving forward to Roman times. The most famous couple to lead the Sanhedrin were Hillel and Shammai. They were the last one, and Hillel and Shammai, it's already in Roman times. By the way, the reason that the Maccabees prevailed, if you want to give a political reason and not just miracles, is that the Romans became stronger and stronger, so the Seleucid empire did not have all the energy to fight against Judah with this little province over here. And Hillel will help us to understand what is the meaning of this oral tradition that is passed on from generation to generation. And this is a story that appears in the Talmud about the president, Nasi, of the Sanhedrin, Hillel the elder. A certain Gentile once came before Shammai and asked him, "How many Torahs have you?" And Shammai answers, 2. We have the written Torah and the oral Torah. So says to him the convert, "I believe you with respect to the written, but not with respect to the oral Torah. Make me a convert on condition that you teach me the written Torah only." Shammai gets all upset and angry and kicks him out. So he comes before Hillel. Shammai was like the vice president of the Sanhedrin. He had another school of thought, and Hillel was the president. He went before Hillel, and Hillel was well known as the most patient man who ever lived. And he accepted him as a convert, happily. And on the first day he taught him Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, taught him the basics. The following day he reversed, and he showed him Aleph and said, "This is Bet." Showed him a Bet and said, "This is Aleph." Showed him a Gimel and said, "This is Dalet." Said to him the convert, "But yesterday you didn't teach me this way, you taught me something else." So Hillel asks him a question, "And you trusted me yesterday? When I said that we read the Aleph like A, and the Bet like Ba, and the Gimel like Ga. So if you relied on me there, it means you rely on me in the oral traditions. Because nowhere in the 5 books of Moses, or in the prophets, or in the writings, does it say how to read a letter, or what is the meaning of a word or a sentence." By the way, the word for letter in Hebrew is a word for sign. Ot. Ot is siman, and ot is a letter. We have symbols, we have signs in the written Torah, but the understanding of the oral tradition is that every symbol is symbolizing something very specific that was passed on from generation to generation. Every word and every sentence. And many of the words and sentences, if you do not have these traditions that were passed on from Sinai, according to Jewish tradition, you will just not understand. So often when we had a commandment that originated from the Torah, we brought it from the Mishnah and Talmud, from the oral law, which is the authority in Jewish tradition to interpret, to explain, and to really give the full context of the text that was given in Sinai. So this is first of all, it's sometimes difficult to understand for people who are not used to the idea of having a written text and an oral tradition together. People today tend to give more respect to the written word, but it is important to understand that this is the Jewish perspective. Also in other religions there are similar perspectives about the text and the context that is passed on from generation to generation. And once we come to talk about daily life and the commandments that a Jew has every day, we'll see quite a few examples of that. We talked already about commandments that the rabbis add, but this is not what we're talking about here. Can you give me an example of laws, Jewish law, that we learned about and is not from the Torah? It wasn't so long ago. Chanukah, Purim, or 2 stories with commandments that are not from the Torah. So we call them rabbinic law, which is not part of the Torah according to Jewish tradition. It is an addition that was added by the sages throughout the generations, by the Great Assembly, by the Sanhedrin, by the rabbis of the Mishnah, Talmud, and until today. But that is not the category of the oral Torah. According to Judaism, the oral traditions are from Sinai. There are interpretations, and the accurate interpretations, according to Judaism, of the law given from God in Sinai. So the rabbis distinguish between things that the rabbis added and things that the rabbis pass on from generation to generation. Since we already came to this nice story in the Babylonian Talmud in the tractate of Shabbat, let's continue the same page in the Talmud, because Hillel will not only introduce there through a story the idea of the oral Torah, but also he'll answer, what is Judaism? A certain Gentile came before Shammai, remember, the vice president, and said to him, make me a convert on condition that you teach me the whole Torah while I am standing on one foot. In other words, he asked him to teach him while he's standing on one foot, means MTV, instant, right away, quickly. Just give me everything. Don't go too much. Give me Judaism in like a crash course on the computer, like in a few hours, and I'll get it. That's what this convert asked for, and of course Shammai gets furious. How could you degrade Judaism like this? And he repulsed him with a builder's cubit, which was in his hand, kicks him out. And then what does the convert do? Come to Hillel. And he said to him, no problem. You're standing on one foot. Yes, I am. 1 foot. Here it is. He said to him, what is hateful to you, do not do it to your friend. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary thereof. Go and learn it. That's it. That is the whole point of all the 613 commandments of the Torah, according to Hillel, to bring you to that level that what is hateful to you, do not do to your friend. The Aramaic, by the way, for the last line here, go and learn it in Aramaic, ve'idach zil gmor. Gmor in Aramaic, learn in English. From here we will have a word that will come later on in this chapter, Gemara. Gemara in Aramaic is the learning, the Jewish learning, and that is a term that we will come to a little later when we come to talk about the Talmud. So we were just introduced to the leader, the most famous leader of the Sanhedrin, Hillel the Elder, in Roman times. And as you well know, the Sanhedrin under the Romans will have great difficulty, and not only the Sanhedrin, also the Jewish people as a whole, as the Romans will be the ones to destroy Jerusalem, to destroy Judah, to exile. We went off the chronological course for a second to talk about Hillel the Elder and some Jewish philosophy about oral law and about Judaism in general, and let's come back. We are now in Roman times. And if we, in our Jewish collective memory, remember one thing about the Roman Empire, this would be the picture. The destruction of a second temple by Titus, completing the work that his father Vespasian started. 9th of Av, the year 70, is the destruction of a temple. And we hear about the leader of the Sanhedrin, the president of the Sanhedrin, at that time, towards the year 70, Yochanan, son of Zakkai. Yochanan ben Zakkai, the president of the Sanhedrin, who comes out of Jerusalem a little before the destruction and negotiates with Vespasian. He was not a part of the revolt at that point. He was not a part of the Zealot Jews. He wanted to save the tradition. He wanted to save the descendants of Hillel, to save the Sanhedrin, to save the rabbinic leadership, and to save Judaism. he understands he cannot save Jerusalem. There is a source in the source sheet which will be available to you. The story of Yochanan ben Zakkai from the Babylonian Talmud is a story full of drama. I'm not giving the whole drama now. I'm giving just the final bottom line. Yochanan ben Zakkai gets the permission to keep a Torah center, the Sanhedrin, the rabbis who pass on the tradition in Yavne. Jerusalem will be destroyed, but in Yavne, Yochanan ben Zakkai can continue. Yochanan ben Zakkai will lead the rabbis, the Sanhedrin, from destroyed Jerusalem to the great challenges of the next generation without a temple. The temple was the heart of the Jewish people. That is where the Jewish people expressed their religion, their connection to God. And now, without a temple, the question of Jewish identity is a huge question. What is Jewish identity? How do you connect to your God? And this is one of the challenges that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his successor, Rabbi Gamliel in Yavne, will have. The question is, how do we keep the Jews that are now scattered all over the world with a clear identity? How do we give him religious meaning without a temple? How do we never forget Jerusalem, even if it's not in our hands? And another challenge, how do we give this? Another challenge. Another challenge, which Rabbi Gamliel, the successor of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, will be the main one to address, will be the challenge of leadership. How do you create a situation where the creative solutions that you have to the prior challenges, giving religious meaning without a temple, remembering Jerusalem, not forgetting it on one hand, but also not depending on it on the other? But if you will be very creative in Yavne, and someone else will be very creative in Rome, and someone else will be very creative in Alexandria, so you'll have many Judaisms, but you will not have one Jewish identity, and you will not have a Jewish continuity. So to have a center of authority was another challenge for this group of people, the Sanhedrin. Remember, when we talk about the Sanhedrin in the Second Temple period, we talked about competition, about lack of authority. Since we had the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees were the group of Jews that followed the Sanhedrin and their tradition, we had the Sadducees that followed the high priest, and we had the people who didn't care and followed whatever political power was in power at the time, whether it will be Greek, Jewish, Roman. They were the ones who enforced rules. We also had a sect of Jews that had a total different philosophy, the Essenes. The Essenes, the high priests, and any Jewish political power that used to be are now not relevant at all with the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile. The only relevant leadership that stayed is the Sanhedrin. And they start amending new customs that will ensure that Judaism remains relevant, that the connection between the Jews and the God of Israel will be maintained also without a temple. For example, remember we learned about the 4 species of Sukkot. You were allowed to take the 4 species of Sukkot on the 7 days of the holiday only in the temple. But now they say wherever you are, you will take the 4 species of Sukkot all 7 days of the holiday, not only on the first day. Blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, things that were in the temple and not anywhere, will now be taken out of a temple into the private sphere of every Jew, no matter where he is. And, of course, sacrifices cannot be brought outside the temple. and an alternative of ritual needs to be developed. The rabbis already start developing based on prayers that they did have. They were prayers that were created in the Second Temple period, but there was no such thing as a mandatory prayer 3 times a day. But this will now be the ritual replacing the sacrifices. Let's take a peek into a discussion that went on in Yavne. Rabbi Gamliel says every day a person must pray 18 blessings of the Amidah. The Amidah is one of the most famous prayers in Judaism. It has 19 blessings because there was one added after this that are said silently, standing. But here we see a discussion. What do you have to say? Rabbi Yeshua says, you can say kind of a short version of the 18 blessings. Rabbi Akiva says, if you know it by heart, if a prayer is fluent in your mouth, he must say 18 blessings. But if it is not, he may say the short version. So we see all these discussions. Do you have to pray also the night prayer, which we call Ma'ariv, Arvit, or only the morning and afternoon prayer? Discussion. We see these discussions and we understand that the generation of Yavne is the one that starts really amending the regular prayers, the ritual, in which the Jewish communities, no matter where they are in the world, will congregate and worship together. Later on, these prayers will be collected into a book called Sidur. The earliest we have is the Sidur of Amram Gaon in the 9th century, or the prayers that are for holidays will be in a book called Machzor. But all the prayers, or basically, of course, the Sidur and the Machzor did not stop growing and having prayers added until the 20th century. Until the 20th century. But in the Tractate of Brachot in the Mishnah, which is a summary of what these rabbis created, we already find all the basis. So these prayers that are now, of course, very clear to every religious, traditional Jew, it is the base for Jewish knowledge, for understanding Jewish culture, because this is what brings Jews together. The service, even if they come once a week or once a year, coming to the synagogue, coming to prayer, is what unites Jews until this days in congregations all around the world. The 3 prayers a day: Shacharit, the morning prayer; Mincha, in the afternoon, or Mincha, if you cannot pronounce the Cha; and Arvit or Ma'ariv, you can choose what is easier for you to remember, from the word Erev. Erev in Hebrew means evening, Ma'ariv, the night prayer. So 3 prayers a day. Very famous texts that are in these prayers. Of course, every prayer is a whole series of texts. And most of them we will not mention here, but I will mention the Shema, one of the most important texts that appears 3 times a day. It appears in Shacharit and in Ma'ariv, not in Mincha, is the prayer of Shema. It is the testimony of a Jewish believer of the oneness of a monotheistic God, of an abstract God, of Israel, and the dedication of all the heart and might of oneself to God, and the passing of that message to the future generations. So that's an individual commitment that is made 3 times a day. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The text, of course, you can find in the prayer book, in the Sidur, or in Deuteronomy chapter 6. So the reading of Shema is an important prayer. And another important prayer we mentioned is the Amidah. The Amidah, those 19 blessings that are said standing up straight, silent, every individual. And since it's silent and not everybody had books in ancient times, so there's also a repetition of the cantor, of the leader of the prayer, but repeats it out loud after everybody says it silently. So that is a prayer called Amidah. And on holidays, we have additions. I would mention perhaps only two. The Musaf. Musaf is the name of a sacrifice in the temple. So although we cannot bring sacrifices today, there is a prayer in, by the way, in Reform Judaism, it is not as popular because the idea of hoping to return to animal sacrifices is not very acceptable there. But in general, in the Orthodox prayer books and conservative, you will find the Musaf, which is a reminder of the sacrifices of that specific day, if it is a Shabbat or a holiday. Another holiday prayer, Hallel. The word Hallelujah, like Hallel, praise God, and that is a series of psalms from the book of Psalms that is read on holidays. So that is just, of course, a few really basic titles of very well-known prayers in the Jewish prayer book, and as we just mentioned, these are developed as mandatory rituals after the destruction of the temple. And to make a distinction from what we said earlier, the reading of the Torah is not part of the prayer every day. It is only on Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat. For those of you who are not acquainted with synagogue, so it may sound a little strange, what's the difference between praying and reading from the Torah? Of course, the same question could be praying or reading from the New Testament or from the Quran. It's not necessarily the same thing, but if to make a long story short, reading from the Torah is reading what God told us. Praying is when mankind addresses God. So these are two different activities, and the Torah reading is added to the prayer on Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat. And on Shabbat, we also add the reading from the prophets. And if you remember the name of that reading of the prophet, it is called Haftarah. So these are a few really basic terms that are important to know. We read in the Talmud about the travels of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin does not stay in Yavne. The Sanhedrin exiled from Jerusalem to Yavne, but then it continues to the Galilee. From Yavne to Usha, and from Usha back to Yavne, and from Yavne back to Usha, and from Usha to Shfar'am, and Shafar Amar in Arabic, and from Shfar'am to Bet She'arim, and from Bet She'arim to Tzipori, and from Tzipori to Tiberias. And these migrations reflect a lot of political changes that happen in this land, and a lot of challenges that were to the Sanhedrin in Yavne. You know, when you move, there's usually a good reason to move, because the most comfortable thing is usually just to stay where you are, where you're already well established. So what made the Sanhedrin move? What are the challenges of the 2nd century after the generation of Yavne? And I would give one name, which is many challenges. And the one name is Hadrian. Hadrian was Caesar from the year 117. He is considered one of the 5 good emperors of the Roman Empire. He was a philosopher. He was an architect. He fortified the empire. You see a picture of a wall, that is the Hadrian's Wall. If you go from the Lake District in England a little north towards Scotland, you will still see today the wall that Hadrian built to fortify the empire against the barbarians in the area of the mountains of Scotland. If you go to Turkey, you will see his city, Adrianopolis. If you go to Greece, you will see the temples he built for Zeus. He was one of the greatest builders and developers of the empire. If you go to Rome, of course, you can go to the Vatican and visit his tomb. Cappella San Angelo in the Vatican is the tomb of Hadrian. And of course, you can go to the finest piece of architecture in the Roman world, the Pantheon, that he built, and some say he even designed, because he was also an architect himself and not only employer of other architects. So he was really a well-known, important, glorified Caesar of the Roman Empire. The Jewish perspective of Hadrian is actually pretty poor. Not so good. We call him Hadrian. May his bones rot to dust in his grave. Hadrian persecuted monotheism, persecuted Jews, and persecuted Christians. Quite a few stories about the difficulties that the Jewish people had here in Judah under Hadrian. For one, any Jewish commandments or learning of Torah was not allowed. The Jewish commandments were very specific. Any Jewish commandment that has any kind of external public display. So he wouldn't go into the plates of Jews and see if they eat pork or not, like the Antiochus in the Chanukah story did, but had an edict against circumcision, against specific commandments that are a display of Jewish faith, and the Talmud tells us did not allow teaching of Torah in public at all. Or in other words, did not allow to pass on the tradition, to ordain the next generation of the Sanhedrin. It's as if he was reading this course exactly, understood the secret of Jewish continuity, and knew exactly what to attack. In geography also, the memory in space, Hadrian takes the Jewish province, that was the name of where we are, Provincia Judea, and he gives it a new name. He will call it now Palestine, Palestina, which is a genius name. He calls it after the Philistine people, because he was a very learned man. The Philistines were pretty much exterminated by the Babylonians back in the First Temple period. But he gives the name of a people that no longer exist in his time. The name of the Philistines he gives to this land, and he actually says it does not belong to the Jews, therefore it will not carry their name. He also gives a new name to Jerusalem. He calls it Ilia Capitolina. Not only does he give Jerusalem a new name, he flattens it to the surface and builds on it a Roman city with a Roman grid and Roman pagan temples. A pagan temple over the Temple Mount, and a pagan temple over the hill of Golgotha, where later on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre will be built. Another famous story that has to do with Hadrian is the 10 martyrs. The 10 people who were executed for teaching Torah, for passing the tradition to the next generation and ordaining the next generation of the rabbis of the Sanhedrin. The most famous one is Rabbi Akiva, executed in Caesarea. Please pay attention. Caesarea has quite a lot of Jewish significance to it. One of the most famous stories is the execution of Rabbi Akiva, and there are quite a few more. After Rabbi Akiva, his colleagues, the rabbis who mourned his death, were the next to be executed. Rabbi Hananiah, son of Terodion, you see him here wrapped in a Torah scroll and put on fire. Between the Torah scroll and his body, the Romans put wet wool, so he would burn slowly. And when he was dying, he said, I see parchments burning and letters floating in the air. And quite a few other stories. We won't go through all the stories of the 10 executed rabbis, but these are the main rabbis that were passing on the generation, from generation to generation, the Jewish tradition. No wonder that against Hadrian there was a revolt. The question of what came earlier, these horrible stories of the revolt, is a historical question that we will leave to history class. But to remind you that the Bar Kokhba revolt between the years 132 and 135 was against Hadrian. And it started off with a big success and ended as a horrible failure. There's a celebration that has to do with events from the 2nd century and from this time period. If the celebration is the celebration of Lag BaOmer, we mentioned it shortly when we talked about the Omer counting, the counting of days between Passover and Shavuot, and we mentioned that there are customs of mourning, of being sad in these days. And the reason to be sad in these days is because 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva died in this period. And then the question is, what exactly happened? The story in the Talmud is they were disrespectful towards one another, and therefore they had a plague and died. We also know that the Talmud opposed the revolt, which was a horrible tragedy at the end, of Bar Kokhba, that Rabbi Akiva did support at the time. And another idea is many students of Rabbi Akiva died in the outcome of Hadrian's response to the revolt. We know that Hadrian killed almost 600,000 Jews in Judah and Israel in response to the Bar Kokhba revolt. It is a horrible catastrophe which really is the end of the Roman oppression that also was described in the Second Temple period with the destruction of the temple. This is just 60 years later, almost 600,000 Jews being killed, according to the Roman historian Dio Cassius. Lag BaOmer, however, is a day of celebration. So what do we celebrate on this day? One, the plague stopped. If you want to take it in the story from the Talmud, so the plague that was because the students were disrespectful stopped. Another understanding is there was some kind of victory in the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Bar Kokhba revolt started as a huge success, and perhaps one of the victories was remembered in this holiday of Lag BaOmer. One more thing that is really the greatest festival of Lag BaOmer is the death of Rabbi Akiva's student, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who hid from the Romans for 12 years even, in Pki'in, in which he dedicated himself to the learning of Jewish mysticism, of Jewish secrets, and to be one of the greatest rabbis of the time. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai left all of his learning after him, and therefore the day that he passed away is considered the day that great gifts were passed on to the Jewish people, and it is the largest festival in Israel. Hundreds of thousands of people on Lag BaOmer come to Mount Meron to light the bonfires. The bonfires also connect to the Bar Kokhba revolt, because the way you communicate in war is by fire. That's why also there are bow and arrows sometimes you'll see on Lag BaOmer. But another thing that has to do with fire is the great fire of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Also the description of his death has to do with fire coming out of him, since he was such a great mystic. And also the book that is attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Zohar, means the huge light. So the fire also connects to the Bar Kokhba revolt, and also connects to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who today is really the main figure, if you talk about the big celebration of Lag BaOmer in Mount Meron. We came from a very distressful note of the stories of Hadrian to mention Lag BaOmer and its connection to the Bar Kokhba revolt and to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But we understand that we're talking about a time period where Judaism was in a great danger. You could not take for granted that Judaism would survive Hadrian. Hadrian was very thorough. When Rabbi Hananiah, son of Terodion, says, I see parchments burning and letters floating in the air, he perhaps means that the letters can continue on, and perhaps means that the letters can be gone. because what he taught, he sees that many of his students will be executed, and that what he wanted to teach, he will never teach again. With the body, also a lot of the knowledge will burn down with him and with his colleagues. And they were afraid, not for their own bodies, these rabbis that were executed, but for the tradition that they were passing on to the next generation, and that was now in great danger. This context is very important in order to understand what happens next. After the death of Hadrian, we hear of emperors that were not all as good to the Roman Empire, but the Jewish people are better off. And that brings us to an emperor called Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, or in a nickname Caracalla. And he was in a good relationship with Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, in the beginning of the 3rd century, understands that he now has the opportunity to save Jewish tradition, which was in great danger. Jewish tradition was attacked viciously just a generation before him. And he understands that the political circumstances are not going to change very soon, but now he has a good relationship with the Roman Empire in the beginning of the 3rd century. And he interviews every sage, every rabbi of the time who was remembering the oral traditions that he gets. Who was memorizing the oral traditions that he got from his rabbi, that got from his rabbi, that he got from his rabbi. The memorization of traditions was not only the traditions themselves, but every tradition exactly what was the source of a tradition, just like a footnote. That's what these rabbis would do. They would memorize. They would repeat the traditions that they learned until they could say them word by word. I am mentioning this also because these rabbis of this time have a special name. They are called Tanaim. All these rabbis of the Sanhedrin, from the Second Temple period until the Mishnah will be written, are called Tanaim. Tana in Aramaic means to repeat. Those who repeated the traditions. By the way, Taf and Shin, T and SH, often kind of switch. The word Tana or Thani also in Arabic means in Hebrew Shani. Right? Shani in Hebrew means second, or Shana to repeat, and in Arabic Thana. So Tana in Aramaic is like Shana in Hebrew. Coming back to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, he brings together all the Tanaim, all the rabbis that were memorizing and repeating these traditions, and he collects them together, interviews them one by one, and chooses the most important traditions for Jewish law, and he puts them in a book called the Mishnah. As we said, Shana in Hebrew means Tana in Aramaic. The Mishnah is the book that will bring together all these memories, traditions, word by word, and which rabbi got from which rabbi from Sinai to here. He understands that although you're not allowed to write down the oral law, there's no choice now. It has to be put to writing, otherwise it may not survive. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi will be the first one to put in an organized fashion the oral law into writing. The Mishnah includes 6 different categories for the different books that are called tractates. So the categories we call orders. In Hebrew, Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. By the way, Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, in an acronym for Shisha Sdarim, Shas. That's why a political party that wants to say we are carrying on Jewish tradition will be called Shas. When we say we learn the Talmud, so we say we learn the Shas. That's just a side note. Coming back to the Mishnah is split into 6 categories, organizing categories in which there'll be different books. So all the books, and books in the Mishnah we call in Hebrew Masechet, or in English tractates, all the tractates that have to do with agriculture in Israel will be included in the order of Zraim, which means seeds. All the tractates that have to do with special times of the year will be included in the order called Moed. For example, the tractate of Shabbat we learned from the 39 Melachot of Shabbat. We read from the tractate of Shabbat, which is in the order of Moed. The tractate of Psachim we learned from about Passover, that is also in Moed. The tractate of Ta'anit about the Tisha B'Av. So every special time will be in this category of Moed. Nashim, woman, everything that has to do between man and woman, for example, the laws, the tractate that has to do with marriage and the tractate that has to do with divorce will both be in this order, in this category. Nezikin is all social laws. How does a society work together? Kodashim, things that have to do with a temple. Although we don't have a temple, but the memory of Jewish law regarding the temple had to be preserved in this order of Kodashim. And another category which is not all relevant without a temple, but many of it is also is Taharot, the laws of purity and impurity. So again, the orders are categories, and in these categories there are books that are called tractates or Masechet. Another Masechet we learn from is Avot. So there are 63 Masachtot, tractates. You don't need to remember that number, but just to understand that they are organized into 6 different categories that are called orders. The 6 orders of the Mishnah. The Mishnah does not include everything that the Tanaim wrote, but Rabbi Yehuda Nasi chose the things that for him were most important. Okay? Any questions? Great. In that case, we'll continue telling the story. With the closure of the Mishnah, we close a period called the period of the Mishnah or the period of the Tanaim. The period that takes us from 70 to around 200, 220, the beginning of the 3rd century, when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi writes the Mishnah. So, as we will also summarize soon, in Judaism we have names to the periods that are not always parallel to the names that are of the whole world. This is a Jewish perspective for names of historical periods. So this is the period of the Mishnah. You'll hear many times when we talk about ancient synagogues, a synagogue from the time of the Mishnah, or a synagogue from the time of the Talmud. And the next topic we will talk about is the Talmud, or the Gemara. So, if we finish the period of the Tanaim, which is the name of the main players that led the Jewish people after the destruction of the temple, we're now starting a period called Amoraim. Amora, A-M-O-R-A, Amora is the rabbi, or Amoraim are the rabbis that said things about the Mishnah. The Mishnah becomes now to be the main textbook of the Jewish world. It will go all the way to Babylon, Iraq of today, and it will of course be the textbook of the Sanhedrin itself that will be moving now from Tzipori, where the Mishnah was written, to Tiberias, and the rabbis, the Amoraim, sit and study the Mishnah word by word. And they choose every time which tractate is most important to study now in order to bring the law to all the Jewish people. So we have one Jewish identity that is clear to everybody. So, for example, what we see here on the screen is a page from the Talmud, which begins always with the Mishnah. So it will begin with the Mishnah, and then after the section from the Mishnah is brought, we have the discussion of the Amoraim, which is called Gemara, where they will discuss every line in the Mishnah. Now, this discussion can go on for several more pages. So the Talmud is the protocol of these discussions of the Amoraim on the Mishnah, which takes every line and tries to understand every detail from this very short composition called the Mishnah. The Mishnah is really a nutshell of Jewish tradition. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi did not elaborate more and more, and now this will be the main textbook, and every line will be elaborated. Every line will be interpreted. Every line will be compared to contradicting lines elsewhere or to contradicting traditions in order to understand exactly what is the right tradition. So the Mishnah will be the base for the Talmud. Not every tractate in the Mishnah will be studied in the Talmud, in Babylon and in Israel. But the Talmud will be a protocol of what was studied and was discussed. So the Talmud is a whole discussion about the Mishnayot that were studied by the Amoraim. The Amoraim, for example, did not write a protocol of discussion about tractates that have to do with a temple. It was not so relevant to people. People were not thirsty to hear about the rules of a temple, but they were thirsty to hear from the rabbis exactly what to do on Shabbat. The Amoraim that lived in Babylon, the rabbis in Babylon that were discussing the Mishnah, wrote less about laws that have to do with agriculture in Israel from the order of Zraim than the rabbis in Tiberias. The Amoraim in Tiberias did write about agriculture of Israel because it was super relevant. So not every tractate in the Mishnah has a tractate in the Talmud. But every tractate in the Talmud comes to elaborate on a section, on a tractate of the Mishnah. What you see here on this page of Talmud also has a frame of rabbis that will come later on, like Rashi from the 11th century and the Tosfot from the 13th century. So today when we study Talmud, we actually have an ongoing discussion. The Mishnah, which is the oral tradition connecting to the written law, to the Torah. And on it we have the Talmud, which is from the period of the Amoraim, from the 3rd century to the 5th century. And on it we have more interpretations that will continue the discussion of Jewish tradition until our times. The reduction of the Babylonian Talmud was made by Ravina and Rabbi Ashi in the year 475, about the end of the 5th century, in Sura, in Babylon, in Iraq. And the reduction of the Jerusalem Talmud by Rabbi Yochanan in Tiberias is a question exactly when. Most scholars believe it was the 4th century. The beginning of the 4th century already is the closure of a Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was written in Tiberias. Remember, the Sanhedrin went to Bet She'arim. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was born in Bet She'arim. Then to Tzipori, where Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi moved the Sanhedrin to, and where he wrote the Mishnah. And then it went to Tiberias. And in Tiberias, the Amoraim discuss the Mishnah and write the Jerusalem Talmud. So why isn't it called the Tiberias Talmud? Why is it called the Jerusalem Talmud? Because they are the continuation of Jerusalem. Right? It's the same Sanhedrin that left Jerusalem to Yavne, Usha, Shfar'am, Bet She'arim, Tzipori, and Tiberias. And of course they would love to sit in Jerusalem, but they cannot. They cannot sit in Jerusalem. It is now the Byzantine times under Christian regime, and the Sanhedrin was not very welcome in Jerusalem. And later on, the year 415, they will even be cancelled by the Byzantine emperor. So they are in worse conditions in Tiberias than they were in Iraq, where they had more freedom and more comfort to really sit and learn and discuss the Mishnah. So we have here two competing centers. the center in Tiberias, which will write the Jerusalem Talmud in the beginning of the 4th century, and the center in Iraq, in Babylon, that will write the Babylonian Talmud at the end, until the end of the 5th century. Two competing centers with competing judgments sometimes. They will not always agree. For example, they do not agree on the Torah reading. How much of a Torah do you read every Shabbat? In Israel, they would read the Torah in a cycle of 3 years and even 7 years in some of the customs. In Babylon, in 1 year. What do we do today? What the Babylonian Talmud said. So in other words, there are two different Talmuds. There is the Babylonian Talmud, mostly Aramaic, less tractates. The Jerusalem Talmud, which is mostly in Hebrew, it also has a lot of Aramaic, and a little more tractates. And there was a competition between them, and the Babylonian Talmud is considered of a higher authority to Jewish law. When we have an argument, we go by the Babylonian Talmud. Why is an interesting question. For one reason, since the circumstances in Babylon were better, also many rabbis chose, and the greater rabbis chose, to dedicate their life to Torah and to learning, and not to the worries of a daily life under the Romans here, and chose to live over there. So it's considered that the level of study there was higher. And another thing, the Babylonian Talmud was later on edited and accepted by the leaders of a Jewish world called Savoraim and Geonim, that we will learn about in the Middle Ages. So also history gave its decisions, and finally the Babylonian Talmud is of higher authority, but they're both existing and very well accepted. Let's try to wrap up what we talked about on Jewish periods from the Second Temple period until the end of the times of the Talmud, and also the base for the Jewish bookshelf. So we talked about the Second Temple period, which is a Jewish term including 3 different periods in the history of the world: the Persian period, the Hellenistic period, and the Roman period. The early Roman, of course. From 538 BCE, the return to Zion, all the way to the year 70, the destruction of the temple. And we call a period after the name player, after the main element of the time. So, on the perspective of a world, the main element would be, in ancient times, the main technology, or the new technology, and in this time, the main empire, Persian, Hellenistic, Roman. In the Jewish perspective, the main element of all this time period is the temple in Jerusalem. Therefore, it's called the Second Temple period. The next period will be called after the main player. Who leads the Jewish world? They don't rule it, but they do lead it. The Tanaim. Therefore, the next period, from the year 70 until the Mishnah is written, is called the period of Tanaim, or named after the book that closes this period, the Mishnah. And there, in the period of the Tanaim, the period of the Mishnah, from the year 70 until the beginning of the 3rd century, I sometimes put 200, sometimes 220, because it's an argument. So if you want to be as accurate as possible, you can say beginning of the 3rd century. And that's the Yavne generation, the Usha generation we talked about with Hadrian, and the reduction of the Mishnah by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi in Tzipori. After the reduction of the Mishnah, we spoke about the next period, the period of the Talmud, where they elaborate tractates of the Mishnah, or the period of, who's the main players? People who lead the Jewish world at the next period, the Amoraim. So the period of the Talmud, named after the book that closes the period, or the period of the Amoraim, from around 200 to the end of the 5th century. And we talked in this period about the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. And now we have really the base for the Jewish bookshelf. We have the trunk. We have the Tanakh, the main book of the people of the book, and on it the Mishnah, and on it the Talmud. Tanakh, with the Torah, the written revelation, and the oral traditions that came also in revelation according to Jewish tradition and would be put to writing and will be put to writing by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in the Mishnah and elaborated in the Talmud. So the Tanakh and the oral tradition, Mishnah and Talmud, that is the foundation of a Jewish bookshelf. In the next chapter, we will start developing the branches that come out of the main trunk as we talk about the different genres and the development of Jewish culture after the times of the Talmud. But for the time being, I think this was definitely enough for one chapter, so take a break. Try to check if you can say a few words about the Mishnah, about the Talmud, about Chanukah, about Lag BaOmer, about Bar Kochba, Hadrian, different things we learned. Make sure you can be active and not only passive, and then we'll come together to chapter 15 and talk about the Jewish bookshelf. But for now, I'll see you later. Goodbye.